It started years before any construction began, before the HOA even had a name. The land in question wasn't some forgotten patch of dirt. It was a valuable, strategically located property on the edge of a rapidly growing suburban sprawl. I had purchased it quietly, through a trust, using legal channels that ensured my name wouldn't appear on the surface of public-facing documents. It wasn't secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was foresight. I knew this area would boom, and I didn't want every developer in town knocking on my door, trying to buy me out or pressure me into a joint venture. So I let it sit. No signs, no fuss. Just land waiting for its purpose. Over the years, I paid the taxes, kept the records clean, and occasionally sent out surveyors to re-verify the boundaries. Quiet maintenance, smart insurance. While others saw open fields, I saw capital. And I wasn't in a rush. I'd seen too many people flip land too quickly and regret it later. I had the patience they didn't. That's what made the difference. Then came the rumblings. A new development proposal. Rumors of an HOA planning a large residential build in the area. Still, no one contacted me. No inquiries, no offers, no mention of the parcel I owned. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Maybe they were building around it. Maybe someone else had sold something nearby. But my instincts told me to dig deeper. I pulled city planning records, reached out to contacts in zoning, and requested building permit logs. What I found was jaw-dropping. A massive residential development project had been approved, and it included my land. All of it. The HOA and their developers had somehow overlooked or outright ignored the actual ownership records. Either they assumed the land was public, or that it had been abandoned, or, worse, they thought no one would notice. But I noticed. I always notice. It was stunningly reckless, especially given the scale of their plans. 120 homes, utilities routed across my parcel, even paved roads that cut through the heart of my property. And it wasn't just a technicality, they were actively pouring foundations. Still, I didn't go public. I didn't send a letter or make a call. That would have tipped them off. Instead, I updated every record I had. I had a legal team run a fine-tooth comb through the county office. We filed quiet title updates, triple-checked parcel maps, and preserved every shred of evidence. I wanted no ambiguity. My ownership was not only intact, it was now bolstered by a bulletproof paper trail. That's when I started documenting everything. I sent in drones. I took timestamp photos. I recorded truck deliveries, cement pouring, survey markers being ignored, and contractors building fences well within my boundary lines. I kept records of their signage advertisements, even copies of their sales brochures. Every misstep, every overreach, every sign of their arrogance, I logged it. Because I knew this wouldn't be settled with a phone call or a town hall meeting. No, this would be settled where it mattered most, in court. As the homes began to take shape, my team began shaping the case. We consulted with land use attorneys, property rights experts, and municipal law professionals. The irony was delicious. They thought they were building their future, but they were actually walking right into mine. Every nail they hammered, every driveway they poured, every family they promised a dream home to, it all strengthened my position. They were investing millions into property that wasn't theirs. And I just had to let them keep going. At this point, the HOA had finalized Phase 1. Roads were being named, streetlights installed, sidewalks lined up. Some homes were even being pre-sold, all without ever speaking to the rightful owner of the land beneath it all. I stayed quiet, not because I was unsure, but because silence was my strategy. If I'd intervened too soon, they could have backtracked, adjusted, or found a way out. But the more they built, the deeper the hole they dug. It was a waiting game. But I wasn't just waiting. I was watching, preparing, building my own foundation, one made of facts, records, and unshakable legal ground. They had their cement. I had my contracts. They had blueprints. I had deeds. They had ambition. I had ownership, and they never saw me coming. The HOA's vision was bold: transform an open swath of undeveloped land into a pristine suburban dream. Their plans boasted cul-de-sacs, community parks, underground utilities, and uniform architectural styles meant to scream luxury and order. To investors, it looked like a gold mine. To future homeowners, it promised safety and structure. To the board of directors, it was their ticket to influence, prestige, and a cut of every homeowner's monthly dues. But to me, it was a red flag waving in the wind. Their ambition blinded them. They moved fast, assuming compliance would follow intention. Instead of confirming ownership through thorough due diligence, they relied on outdated maps, rough assumptions, and bad intel. Somewhere along the way, someone either made a critical clerical error or deliberately ignored the land's ownership status. I wasn't just skipped over, I was erased in their version of the planning. It began with subtle signs. Utility flags popped up along the outer edges of my property. Trucks came and went during early morning hours, their presence vague and temporary. Surveyors stood on my land, looking confident but clearly out of sync with the actual parcel lines. I didn't confront them at first. I watched. I recorded. I knew from experience that people who move this fast leave footprints, and I intended to track every single one. What struck me the most was their arrogance. There were no notices, no attempts at communication, no requests for access. It was as if they believed their project gave them automatic rights to everything in its path. The HOA had fallen victim to its own echo chamber. Their board members, none of whom were legal experts, kept repeating the same incorrect assumptions to one another until they all believed them to be fact. This land is clear. It's city-owned. There's no record of private ownership. Each statement was wrong, but none were questioned. As the weeks passed, the machinery grew louder. Crews poured foundations, laid gravel, ran trenching for water lines. I received no notification. No developer contacted me. No title company reached out to verify ownership. It was full steam ahead. They were deep in phase one of construction before anyone even thought to double-check a parcel map. Even then, the discovery came too late. What they didn't understand was the difference between assumed access and legal access. Just because you can walk on land doesn't mean you own it. Just because it looks empty doesn't mean it's unclaimed. Just because something doesn't show up in your initial paperwork doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The HOA operated like bulldozers were stronger than boundary lines. They mistook noise for legitimacy, speed for security, and confidence for correctness. They also underestimated what happens when ambition runs unchecked. In their rush to build, they bypassed critical review steps. City planners were misled, county clerks were handed incomplete paperwork, and investors were kept in the dark. The entire project was built on a house of cards. The deeper they dug, the more risk they stacked on themselves. I didn't have to interfere. I just had to observe while they handed me all the leverage I needed. Their promotional materials started circulating. Modern homes in a serene new community, they advertised. Starting in the low 600s. They listed home lots by number, unaware that some of those numbers were sitting directly on my deeded land. I took screenshots. I documented timestamps. Everything they published became more evidence of their blind overreach. It reached a point where construction crews began trespassing openly. Trucks parked on my access roads. Materials were stacked in the corners of my property. Their own boundary markers drifted farther and farther past where they should have stopped. I started receiving calls from confused subcontractors who thought I was the landowner for a different section. Even the workers on the ground seemed more informed than the people calling the shots. There was no malice in the laborers. They were just following orders. But the HOA leadership? That was another story. They were the engine behind the madness, pushing schedules forward, refusing to acknowledge mistakes, and dismissing any red flags raised by their consultants. When one junior engineer raised a concern about a title discrepancy, he was overruled. The leadership saw delay as a bigger threat than legal exposure. That decision would cost them everything. They pushed ahead with full certainty that they were untouchable. They had contracts with builders, timelines with suppliers, and commitments to families that had already paid deposits. Turning back wasn't part of the plan. They believed that once construction passed a certain point, I would have no choice but to negotiate or sell. But they didn't realize I wasn't some forgotten name on a dusty ledger. I was very much aware, very much prepared, and very much in control of everything they had just built their future upon. While the HOA was busy sketching blueprints and selling their suburban dream to buyers and investors, I was carefully building something else entirely, a paper trail. Every inch of that property was accounted for in legally binding documentation, and every document was kept in meticulous order. The first deed dated back over a decade, clean and uncontested, held under a trust one controlled. The zoning documents, title insurance, and recorded surveys were all updated and accessible. I wasn't the type to buy and forget. I was the type to buy, secure, and verify. And in this case, that made all the difference. Most developers rely on a web of assumptions and fast-tracked approvals. When time is money, they cut corners. But when they cut through my land, they didn't realize that every corner they skipped became another card in the deck I was stacking against them. What they overlooked as irrelevant paperwork was, in fact, a series of legal tripwires. They couldn't see them, but the moment they stepped into my property line, they started triggering each one. It started with boundaries. Their surveys were based on general plat maps, not on-site verification. I had the certified boundary reports done by licensed surveyors and recorded with the county clerk's office. Those maps clearly defined the limits of my land, down to the inch. And they didn't just exist in a drawer. They were uploaded to the public system, time-stamped, notarized, and backed by years of tax filings and property assessments. The HOA's maps? They were broad, vague, and filled with assumptions. Then came the permits. While they thought they were in compliance with the city's development codes, they hadn't realized that part of their infrastructure plan included easements and access roads that were technically situated on my parcel. Without my signature, those permits were invalid. But the city had approved them because they were submitted under the belief that the HOA had secured all necessary land rights. They hadn't. That error alone could have triggered immediate work stoppage orders, but I didn't pull that lever yet. I waited. One of the most important documents I had in my favor was a restrictive covenant recorded years earlier, one that limited development use on my land without direct written consent from the owner. It was buried in the county records, not obvious unless you were doing deep due diligence. They hadn't done that. Their attorneys either missed it or didn't think it mattered. It mattered more than anything. I also had quiet title actions filed over the years to remove any ambiguity over overlapping claims. I wasn't fighting for the land. I already owned it. What I had done was remove any legal gray area where someone might later try to assert conflicting claims. My title was clean, definitive, and court-backed. Their claims, on the other hand, were rooted in paperwork that was incomplete at best, negligent at worst. Once the construction escalated, I began documenting the trespass. My legal team helped me draft certified letters of notice and pre-litigation filings, but we didn't send them immediately. Each act of trespass, each delivery truck, each bulldozer, each newly poured sidewalk was captured on camera, logged in spreadsheets, and cataloged by date and time. We wanted to build a timeline so clear and so detailed that when it came time to act, there would be no room for denial or delay. Every action they took became more evidence in our favor. They never asked for permission. They never inquired about ownership. They just assumed that because the land looked vacant, it was theirs to use. That assumption was the foundation of their entire mistake. And because of that mistake, I didn't just have a legal case. I had a strategic advantage. I didn't have to prove they harmed me. I only had to show that I never gave consent, that I had every legal document in place, and that they had violated my rights repeatedly and openly. We even conducted a private audit of the contractors and subcontractors working on site. Many of them had assumed they were operating under valid contracts. But the fine print of those contracts included clauses about liability in case of invalid land use. That meant if things went south, the HOA couldn't shift the blame without triggering more lawsuits. I had their liability boxed in from every angle. Even their own promotional materials, press releases, and development brochures became part of our record. In them, they described the land as acquired and fully permitted. They used language that implied ownership. But my name, or rather, the name of the trust that held the title, was never mentioned. That omission wasn't just an oversight. It was a smoking gun. I had no need to move fast, no urgency to disrupt their progress. Every passing day tightened the knot around their project. While they built homes, I built leverage. Every forgotten permit, every skipped step, every overlooked file, they all became the threads of a net they couldn't see, one that was closing around them piece by piece. Legal leverage doesn't come from shouting or threats. It comes from paperwork, planning, and precision. Long before the HOA ever stepped onto my land, I'd laid the groundwork for what would become the most important clause they never saw coming. Tucked neatly into the chain of title, recorded and validated years prior, was a binding easement restriction with what's known as a reversionary trigger. That clause, simple in wording but ironclad in its implications, ensured that any unauthorized use, development, or encroachment would activate full land use reversion back to my control, including financial liabilities for any unapproved structures built on the property. Most developers, especially ones racing the clock, never bother to read deep into land records or title abstracts. They trust summaries from underwriters or rely on assurances from low-bid legal counsel. That's where they slipped. This clause was publicly recorded but not highlighted, buried just deep enough that a casual search wouldn't reveal it. But it was there, signed, sealed, and acknowledged by the county. I had paid top dollar years ago to ensure the language was bulletproof. They had built their entire community on land that was legally booby-trapped, and they had no clue. The reversionary clause wasn't the only trap. I had filed supplementary documents tied to the original deed. Usage limitations, environmental compliance restrictions, and even a mandatory notification clause. That meant that any material change, subdivision, or construction activity on the land required direct, written notification to the owner of record, me. That notification never came. Not once. The moment they poured the first slab of concrete, they had already breached the conditions that allowed them to operate freely. That breach gave me full legal standing and, more importantly, the upper hand. I anticipated the possibility of developers trying to leverage adjacent lots to loop my land into a larger project. That's why I'd created a layered ownership structure. The land was held by a trust, but the mineral rights were owned by a separate entity. The air rights? Those were registered under an LLC. Each layer gave me independent leverage, meaning even if they tried to buy out or negotiate with one entity, the others still had legal claims. They would have to go through 3 different legal bodies just to begin clearing the title, and by that time, they would already be buried in lawsuits. When we reviewed the HOA's filings and public statements, we noticed something critical. They had claimed in multiple documents that they owned or had access to 100% of the land within the development boundary. That was factually false. The presence of that claim, repeated in contracts, advertising, and legal filings, meant they had not only breached property rights, but also potentially committed fraud and disclosure. That gave my attorneys the opening we needed to prepare a civil suit with claims extending beyond basic trespass. Now we were looking at deceptive practices, bad faith development, and potentially even federal scrutiny, depending on how much investor money was involved. The language in my clause also gave me options. I didn't have to sue immediately. I could issue a formal cease and desist, trigger a temporary restraining order, or escalate directly to a property seizure claim under state land code. That kind of flexibility is power. While they were bound by construction loans, hard timelines, and buyer contracts, I had the luxury of patience. Every day they delayed in responding strengthened my case. Every dollar they spent deepened their liability. The final nail came when one of their buyers unknowingly reached out to me. They were seeking clarification on the property line because their title company had flagged a potential conflict. That moment confirmed everything we needed. Their own clients were starting to see the cracks. The clause I had written wasn't just about protecting the land. It was about creating the option to own every inch of what they tried to take. The HOA had built homes, roads, and infrastructure on a foundation they didn't own. And the documents I filed years before had made sure that the moment they crossed the line, they handed me the keys to their future. I didn't make threats. I didn't need to. The language was already doing the talking. My clause was written with clarity, reviewed by professionals, and tested against state statutes. It was the kind of clause that developers hate, unavoidable, enforceable, and irrevocable once triggered. They had walked into it willingly, completely unaware that the moment they broke ground, they handed me the very leverage they assumed they had taken from me. What looked like a silent piece of paper in a county file cabinet was, in truth, the most powerful weapon in this entire dispute. It didn't scream. It didn't shout. It simply waited to be activated. When the time came to act, it wasn't with anger or theatrics. It was with evidence, timing, and absolute control. The moment my legal team filed the lawsuit, the reaction was immediate. What started as confident board meetings and cheerful ribbon-cutting ceremonies quickly shifted into closed-door panic and emergency legal consultations. They had been blindsided, not because the information wasn't out there, but because they never thought someone would actually push back with the force of the law. What they thought would be a minor hiccup became a full-blown legal disaster. The courthouse became the stage where their entire development began to unravel. The foundation of our case was built on undeniable documentation. Every trespass, every foundation poured, every fence post driven into my land, all of it was backed by satellite imagery, drone footage, timestamp surveys, and notarized affidavits. It wasn't a claim. It was a presentation of facts. The HOA had violated property rights in the clearest, most measurable way. And because they did at scale, 120 homes, full road systems, and utility infrastructure, they had done so in a way that compounded the damages with every square foot. In court, their lawyers scrambled to establish good faith, claiming it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, or a bureaucratic oversight. But the judge didn't need to hear opinions. The documents told the whole story. Not only had they failed to obtain proper authorization, but they had actively published and profited from that failure, using my land as leverage to pre-sell homes, secure funding, and market a development they never fully owned. That moved the case out of simple land dispute territory and into the realm of fraud, negligence, and bad faith dealings. They tried to shift blame to contractors and city planning departments. They claimed that the responsibility rested with surveyors or junior developers. But the contracts all bore their signature. The filings were made under their name. The HOA, in all its eagerness to expand and profit, had bypassed basic due diligence and had done so while collecting payments and issuing public statements that denied my ownership outright. That opened the door for claims of defamation, unjust enrichment, and intentional interference with property rights. We didn't just go after the HOA entity. We named individual board members. Their decisions, their signatures, their votes, all of it came into play. Many of them were shocked. They had assumed limited liability protected them. But when you're acting outside of legal authority, especially in a position of influence, personal liability becomes a very real risk. That tactic cracked their defenses. Board members who once stood unified began pointing fingers at each other. Some resigned. Others settled privately. Internal cohesion collapsed. The court proceedings revealed even more. Emails surfaced showing that at least one member had raised concerns about unclear ownership early in the process. That concern had been dismissed, ignored, buried. But in legal terms, that email was damning. It proved awareness. It eliminated plausible deniability. It made the board look not just careless, but willfully negligent. That changed the tone of the case entirely. Suddenly, it wasn't just a property rights dispute. It was a question of character, ethics, and responsibility. The judge issued a preliminary injunction that halted all construction immediately. That meant every ongoing project stopped overnight. Contractors pulled out. Buyers began calling their agents. Title companies froze closings. The financial bleeding had begun. And while they scrambled to triage the damage, we continued tightening the legal noose. The more they tried to untangle, the more they realized how far off course they had gone. Depositions followed. We brought in experts to testify about proper land acquisition protocol. We presented alternative timelines showing how the HOA could have easily discovered the issue months earlier if they had performed even basic checks. We even had video of their construction trucks driving past posted property line markers without pausing, proof that they weren't just unaware. They were actively ignoring the evidence in front of them. Media began picking up the story. 120 homes built on the wrong land, read one headline. Public opinion shifted fast. Buyers who had put down deposits began threatening lawsuits of their own. Investors began distancing themselves. Confidence in the project collapsed. The HOA board, once emboldened by plans and projections, now sat on the verge of dissolution. Their legal fees ballooned. Their timeline vanished. Their entire vision for the community now depended on a settlement. They no longer had the leverage to negotiate. We never had to yell, never had to threaten. We simply followed the trail they had laid and used their own words, actions, and contracts against them. In the courtroom, their entire project collapsed. Not because we demanded it, but because it had no legal legs to stand on. They had ignored the boundaries, ignored the warnings, and ignored the rules. And in doing so, they walked right into a legal wall they never saw coming. After the dust of litigation settled and the HOA's empire of assumptions came crashing down, a strange silence took hold. The kind of silence that comes after a storm, not from peace, but from sheer disbelief. They had spent millions developing a community on land they didn't legally control, and now that oversight had flipped everything. Not only did I retain ownership of the land beneath 120 completed and semi-completed homes, but I now held the keys to their very existence. Every legal move they made going forward had to pass through me. Every property they tried to sell, every road they needed to maintain, every pipe they wanted to repair, all of it required my signature, my terms, my price. Owning their future wasn't just about taking back control. It was about watching a system built on arrogance and speed collapse under the weight of precision and patience. The HOA was forced to come to the table, not with power, but with apologies and proposals. They tried to regain some ground by offering compensation, land swaps, and revenue shares from property sales. But it was too late to dictate terms. They no longer held the upper hand. Every home they had pre-sold, every driveway poured, every buyer locked into a mortgage was now part of a system that legally relied on my permission to function. Utilities were among the first pain points. The water and sewage lines ran through my property without a legal easement. That meant I could deny access, charge usage fees, or revoke their operation entirely. They had no fallback plan. They hadn't built a bypass, hadn't created redundancy. They had built assuming ownership that was never theirs. With one letter from my attorney, we paused operations on a main pipeline servicing nearly half the development. That wasn't to be cruel. It was to remind them that every step forward now came with conditions. Road access followed. The main road leading into the subdivision curved across my land for approximately 150 feet. It was just enough to make it impossible to relocate without destroying multiple homes. That sliver of pavement became the most valuable stretch of real estate in the county. I had it surveyed again, and we installed markers to indicate its precise location. They couldn't pretend anymore. Every resident, every delivery truck, every emergency vehicle passed through land they didn't own. I offered access agreements, but not without conditions. Terms had to be met, maintenance fees had to be paid, and all usage had to be documented. I wasn't just a landowner now. I was the gatekeeper to the entire community. The HOA's leadership had changed by then. The original board had mostly resigned or been replaced in the wake of the lawsuits and mounting pressure. The new leadership was quieter, more cautious, and far more respectful. They no longer opened conversations with demands or assumptions. They asked questions, sought clarification, and requested permission. That shift in tone said everything about the new power structure. They understood now that I wasn't an obstacle. I was the only reason they still existed. Even real estate agents began to approach me directly. They needed clarity for title insurance, buyer disclosures, and access agreements. No transaction could move forward without addressing the underlying issue, my land. I established a review process for each home sale. Every transaction required a fee for land usage, and all buyers had to sign an acknowledgement that their property existed on a parcel governed by a private access agreement. The shock on their faces when they realized the HOA didn't fully control the land was priceless. Some backed out. Others negotiated harder. But none could ignore the reality. I wasn't going anywhere. Eventually, the development couldn't market itself as fully owned or unencumbered. Every listing had to include language about shared land rights and access control. That alone diminished the resale value of the homes. Buyers hate uncertainty, and this situation reeked of it. The market responded with hesitation. Prices dropped. Interest waned. The once hyped development became known more for its legal scandal than its amenities. And I own the story. Investors who had once seen the HOA as a safe bet now viewed the project as a cautionary tale. I had received calls from legal teams representing those investors, asking about future use terms, potential settlements, and ongoing land control clauses. The tables had turned entirely. The people who once ignored me were now lining up to negotiate. They weren't trying to buy the land anymore. They were asking for permission to function on it. That's not ownership. That's dependency. And that dependency gave me permanent leverage. It wasn't just about money. Sure, they now paid land use fees, and I negotiated separate contracts with service providers to ensure compliance with my rights. But more than that, it was about the fact that the HOA, which once operated independently, could no longer make a major decision without contacting me first. They needed approvals for signage, road maintenance, landscaping contracts, and any structural upgrades that touched my property lines. Every meeting they held had to include a legal review of how my ownership affected their actions. I had become part of their process, not by joining them, but by outlasting them.